Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 9 of my exclusive YouTube series, The Greatest Albums of All Time, heard exclusively on the LA Lamb channel. I want to thank everyone who has supported this channel and have watched my album profiling series. I'm a big album person. It's something I love to do, and I love talking about great albums, and it's something I will continue to do from time to time. As you all know, I have profiled some great albums during the first 8 episodes of this series, and in episode 9 I'm going to stay in the 1970s, specifically 1977, and talk about one of the great albums of that year. 1977, in my opinion, is one of the greatest years as far as landmark, iconic album recordings. And in my opinion, in 1977, there were truly 5 great landmark masterpiece albums that were released in that year. The Eagles' Hotel California, Fleetwood Mac's iconic album Rumors, which I profiled on episode 4 of my series, Earth, Wind & Fire's great classic album All in All, which will be celebrating its 40th anniversary in November of this year, and you can be sure that I will be profiling that album in a future episode. And in December, probably the biggest selling motion picture soundtrack of all time, the original motion picture soundtrack to the 1977 movie Saturday Night Fever, featuring the Bee Gees and various artists. But on this episode, in tribute to Walter Becker, who passed away on Sunday, I am going to be paying tribute and profiling the album that he did in partnership with Donald Fagen. Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, you probably know them better as Steely Dan. And in 1977, in September, they released their great landmark album called Aja, spelled A-J-A. In the late 60s, Walter Becker and Donald Fagen met each other, and both found that they had a similar love for improvisational jazz, R&B, and pop, and decided to get together and form a band. And their band was loosely made up of a bunch of guys, and they made some great stuff in the early 70s, but they were hamstrung by a couple of things. One, that Donald Fagen, who was the lead singer of the group, had incredible stage fright and did not like to sing on stage, and so they had one of the other members sing the songs on the stage. And the other issue was the fact that Walter Becker and Donald Fagen were incredible perfectionists, and as such, it took them so long to record an album, and also knowing that they could never possibly duplicate on stage what they did in the studio. In 1972, they decided no longer to perform in concert and just do studio-based recordings. And the other various members dropped out at that point. They became a duo, and they became, quite frankly, the greatest rock and roll duo of all time. But in saying that, that's not to say that Donald Fagen and Walter Becker played all of the instruments and did all the vocals on their album tracks. In fact, what they did was something quite opposite, something that no other recording act had ever done, and that was record albums featuring the two of them and some of the greatest studio musicians in the industry on both the East Coast and West Coast, starting in around 1972 with great songs like Do It Again and Ricky Don't Lose That Number. They made some great albums leading up to 1977, when they recorded and released their pinnacle album, their greatest selling album, the album known as Aja. Aja was an interesting album, as there was no thematic type of linking to all of the songs, but what linked them was the fact that they were all incredible recordings that were all recorded with different studio musicians from the East Coast and the West Coast. And again, because Donald Fagen and Walter Becker were such perfectionists, they would use various studio musicians. Not happy with a certain musician, they would let that one go, bring in another one, and they would just keep using musicians until they found the one or ones that they like, and there you got a recording. And amongst some of the great songs on the Asia album was Deacon Blues, one of the greatest kind of improvisational jazz songs that you will ever hear from a pop-oriented outfit. But in my opinion, the greatest song that Steely Dan ever recorded, the song that is the anchor of the Asia album, was a song that they called Peg. Peg, there's been many stories about exactly what that song is about, but what I can say is that it was an absolute great recording, which was the culmination of some great musicians. Great musicians that Donald Fagen and Walter Becker brought together from the East Coast and the West Coast for the sole purpose of recording this one song. And the musicians who had the honor and privilege of working with these two brilliant musicians were in awe of them and were most happy to be a part of any recording with Steely Dan. In the 90s, VH1, a music channel, they released a series called Classic Albums, in which they profiled about 20 or more classic albums, including Steely Dan's Asia. And if you've never seen this video before, I urge you to go on YouTube and watch it, or go on Amazon and order it, because in the video it profiles just about every song on that album, in which Donald Fagen and Walter Becker are talking about it. And one of the songs that they profile is, of course, Peg. And they also profile some of the musicians that appeared on that. Rich Marotta, one of the great session drummers of the 70s, said himself that that was the greatest track studio experience that he ever had, working with a bunch of studio musicians. Chuck Rainey, a great studio bass player. So great that Walter Becker, who was the bass player of their outfit, said after listening to Chuck Rainey, I said, this is the guy that I want on our recordings. And Chuck Rainey did a little something different. Back in the mid to late 70s, the slapping bass technique was really popular amongst bass players, particularly Larry Graham and Louis Johnson of the Brothers Johnson. Now, Donald Fagen and Walter Becker were no great fans of the slapping bass technique, but Chuck Rainey figured out a way to sneak that in. And if you hear, he plays a very different bass style between the verses of Peg and the chorus. If you listen to the chorus of Peg, you will hear the slapping bass sound that Chuck Rainey plays. That, in fact, after listening to it, both Donald Fagen and Walter Becker liked it, the way it sounded, so much that they went on and kept it on the track, even though both of them admittedly were not fans of the slapping bass technique. Michael McDonald, of course, the lead singer of the Doobie Brothers, and someone who had worked with the Doobie Brothers, with Steely Dan in the early years, appeared on that track and did background vocals. And if you listen to the background vocals that Donald Fagen created for him, they were both weird and haunting and beautiful in their sound at the same time. And it is worth it to watch YouTube channel and listening to Michael McDonald describe how he was able to record and duet with himself the 3 to 4 different notes that he needed to sing in order to record the backing vocals to the song Peg. But they weren't through with it yet. They still were not satisfied with this recording, and what they weren't satisfied was with the guitar solo. They went through probably about 6 different guitar solos, not satisfied with any of them until a guitar player named Jay Graydon came up with this great guitar solo that Donald Fagen and Walter Becker liked so much. That is the guitar, that iconic guitar solo that you hear on the song Peg was in fact the 6th or perhaps 7th one that was recorded, and the one that they finally used after rejecting the first 5 or 6 guitar solos. And if Jay Graydon is a name that sounds familiar to you, he was the co-writer along with Bill Champlin and David Foster of Earth, Wind & Fire's great 1979 ballad, After the Lover's Gone. So Jay Graydon, a great lead guitar player and a great songwriter. And with that, they formed and recorded and released one of the greatest albums of all time, an album called Asia. And this particular profiling the greatest albums of all time is dedicated to the memory of Walter Becker, one of the great musicians of all time in the music industry. This is L.A. Lim, thanking you all for watching. Please leave your comments. I know there are a lot of Steely Dan fans out there, so leave comments. Let me know what you think, what you have to say. I'm always interested in what you have to say. The next episode, I'll see if I can find another album from the 80s, and maybe I might have to go back to the 60s again. You never know. As always, I like to leave with you what is in my heart, which I say at the end of every episode, which is love is life. I love everyone, so show some love to someone today. This is L.A. Lim saying, ciao bella.